Blood dripped from the executioner's axe as Henry VIII carved his path through wives and enemies alike. But the most devastating wounds he inflicted were on his own children. 3 siblings, bound by royal blood, yet torn apart by their father's ruthless ambition, would battle for England's soul in ways that would shock a nation. What appears at first glance as a simple tale of royal succession reveals itself as something far more sinister, a psychological masterpiece of manipulation that would pit sister against sister, brother against both, in a deadly game where crowns were won through tears and survival demanded the sacrifice of family bonds. If you're fascinated by the dark secrets of royal history and want to uncover more untold stories of power, betrayal, and survival, hit that like button and subscribe, because the Tudor dynasty holds mysteries that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous family. The scene opens in the shadow of a tyrant's throne, where Henry VIII stood as history's most merciless monarch. He had already dispatched 2 wives to the scaffold and shattered centuries of religious tradition, breaking with Rome itself, all for one burning, consuming obsession. He needed a male heir, a son to carry the Tudor name into eternity and secure a dynasty that felt perpetually on the edge of collapse. Yet this very hunger for legacy, this desperate thirst for continuity, would become the poison that nearly destroyed everything he sought to protect, creating a family tragedy that historians have only begun to fully understand. Consider the breathtaking irony that defines Henry's reign. A king so desperately committed to securing his dynasty that he systematically dismantled the very foundation upon which it stood. His treatment of his own children reads like a masterclass in psychological warfare, each decision calculated to break their spirits and bend them to his will. He humiliated Mary with surgical precision, stripping away her legitimacy like removing armor before battle, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. He cast Elizabeth into the same shameful exile, teaching both daughters that their father's love was conditional, temporary, and utterly unreliable. And when Edward finally arrived, the precious, long-awaited son, Henry had already demonstrated to his daughters that survival in the Tudor court meant viewing each other not as family, but as potential threats to be managed or eliminated. Mary Tudor entered this treacherous world as her father's golden hope, the shining answer to years of desperate prayers and increasingly frantic attempts to secure an heir. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was a Renaissance woman of extraordinary learning and fierce intelligence who understood that knowledge was power, especially for a future queen. Catherine ensured her daughter received an education that could rival any future monarch's preparation, surrounding Mary with the finest tutors, the most challenging texts, and the highest expectations. Young Mary absorbed this knowledge like a desert flower, drinking rain, developing an intellect sharp enough to match any nobleman in Henry's court, and a confidence that could only come from being a beloved, cherished child who believed with absolute certainty that she was destined for greatness. The young princess lived in a world of silk and ceremony, where every day reinforced her special status as heir to England's throne. She studied languages with native speakers, debated theology with learned clerics, and practiced the delicate art of statecraft that would one day govern her reign. Mary's childhood was a carefully constructed preparation for power, every lesson designed to shape her into a monarch worthy of the Tudor name. She believed, with the unshakable confidence that only a truly loved child can possess, that her future was written in the stars themselves. Then came the earthquake that would shatter her world forever. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn wasn't merely romantic passion, it was theological revolution, political calculation, and desperately practical necessity, all wrapped into one explosive package. He convinced himself, with the fervor of a true believer, that God had cursed his marriage to Catherine, that divine displeasure explained the lack of surviving male heirs, and that only by casting aside his wife of over 20 years could he secure the son England so desperately needed. When Catherine refused to cooperate with this convenient theological revelation, and when the Pope had the audacity to disagree with the King of England's interpretation of divine will, Henry made a decision that would echo through generations. He would drag his teenage daughter directly into the battlefield of his marital war. The king's cruelty toward Mary defies modern comprehension and challenges our understanding of paternal love itself. He weaponized her filial devotion, using her deep love for her mother as a tool of torture. Henry forbade Mary from seeing her dying mother unless she acknowledged his new marriage as legitimate, unless she admitted that everything she had been taught about her own identity was a lie. Imagine the exquisite torment. A teenage girl forced to choose between comforting her dying mother and maintaining her own sense of truth and honor. Mary, displaying the stubborn courage that marked every Tudor, refused to bend to her father's demands. The price for this integrity was devastating. Frequent mysterious illnesses that seemed to manifest from pure stress, mental anguish that left her bedridden for days, and the constant gnawing threat of being declared a bastard and losing everything that defined her existence. The pressure was relentless and increasingly creative in its cruelty. Henry's courtiers, eager to please their volatile master, devised new humiliations daily. They questioned Mary's legitimacy in public, forced her to acknowledge Anne Boleyn's superiority, and demanded she renounce not just her mother's marriage but her own royal blood. For a proud teenager who had been raised from birth to believe in her divine right to rule, these demands represented nothing short of spiritual torture, a systematic destruction of her very identity. September 7th, 1533, brought no celebration to Mary's increasingly dark world, only fresh humiliation dressed in swaddling clothes. Elizabeth's birth wasn't simply the arrival of a half-sister, it was Mary's official, public, and utterly final demotion from princess to servant. The girl who had once been heir to England, who had studied statecraft and languages in preparation for her crown, was now forced to attend her infant replacement like any common lady in waiting. She carried Elizabeth's train, bowed to a baby who had stolen her birthright, and endured the daily reminder that her father's love was nothing more than political calculation. The symbolism was devastating and deliberate. Mary, once addressed as Your Royal Highness, was now simply Lady Mary, stripped of her titles like a convicted criminal stripped of rank. Her household was dissolved, her servants dismissed, her very apartments reassigned to serve the new princess. Every aspect of her daily life became a reminder of her fall from grace, every interaction a fresh wound to her pride and sense of self. The psychological pressure was relentless and increasingly sophisticated in its cruelty. Day after day, week after week, Henry's courtiers demanded Mary admit her illegitimacy, recognize Anne as the rightful queen, and accept Elizabeth as the true heir to England's throne. For a proud teenager raised to believe in her own royal destiny, trained from birth to see herself as God's chosen vessel for continuing the Tudor line, these demands were nothing short of spiritual warfare designed to break her will and reshape her very soul. Then, in a twist worthy of the greatest Greek tragedies, fortune's wheel spun with devastating speed. Catherine of Aragon died in January 1536, and even with her final breath, she refused to acknowledge Henry's new marriage or accept the legitimacy of his actions. Her last words were a testament to her unwavering faith and stubborn courage, qualities she had passed on to her daughter in full measure. Henry, displaying the compassion of a viper protecting its territory, denied Mary permission to attend her mother's funeral, denying her even the basic comfort of saying goodbye to the woman who had shaped her understanding of honor, duty, and faith. While the king and Anne Boleyn celebrated Catherine's death with shocking callousness, hosting feasts and entertainments that seemed designed to mock the dead queen's memory, they failed to notice the precarious nature of their own position. Power in Henry's court was always temporary, always subject to the king's changing whims, and Anne's spectacular rise had created as many enemies as admirers. Anne's triumph lasted mere months before the wheel turned again. By spring 1536, she found herself in the Tower of London, accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Charges that most historians now believe were entirely fabricated to give Henry the legal justification he needed to rid himself of a wife who had failed to produce the male heir she had promised. The woman who had destroyed Mary's world, who had been the catalyst for England's break with Rome and the source of so much family anguish, lost her head to the same executioner's blade she had cheered when it fell on others who opposed her rise to power. In this moment of chaos and shifting alliances, Mary faced a choice that would haunt her for the remainder of her life. Grief-stricken over her mother's recent death, terrified by her father's demonstrated willingness to execute anyone who defied him, and emotionally exhausted by years of psychological warfare, she finally surrendered. In a moment that felt like betraying everything her mother had stood for, Mary acknowledged Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England and accepted her own illegitimacy in writing. The words tasted like poison as she wrote them, but they purchased something precious: a return to court and a chance to rebuild some form of relationship with the father who had systematically destroyed her childhood. The price of this surrender was enormous, and Mary would spend the rest of her life trying to atone for what she saw as a moment of weakness. But it bought her survival in a court where survival itself was never guaranteed, and it opened the door to a cautious reconciliation with the father, whose approval she still desperately craved despite everything he had done to her. Autumn 1537 brought the miracle Henry had prayed for, schemed for, and sacrificed so much to achieve. Edward, the son who would justify every cruel decision, every broken promise, every severed head that had marked his path to this moment. Henry's joy was boundless and almost manic in its intensity. Finally, after decades of marriage, annulment, execution, and political upheaval, he had his heir. In his euphoria, his daughters became afterthoughts, interesting curiosities rather than central players in the dynasty's future. The entire court, with its finely tuned instincts for power, immediately reoriented itself around this precious prince, leaving Mary and Elizabeth to discover something unexpected in their shared abandonment: the possibility of genuine sisterhood. Edward's birth created an odd sort of equilibrium in the Tudor family dynamics. Both sisters now shared the same complicated, tainted status in their father's eyes. Illegitimate children whose value lay not in their inherent worth, but in their potential utility to the crown. This shared predicament, this mutual understanding of what it meant to be simultaneously royal and rejected, fostered a cautious but genuine alliance between the half-sisters. Elizabeth, no longer the heir apparent, received better education as her household was reorganized. Mary was welcomed back to court more frequently, her presence no longer seen as a direct challenge to the new baby's supremacy. For a brief, precious period, the Tudor siblings almost resembled something approaching a normal family. The irony was palpable. Edward's birth, which should have made Mary and Elizabeth rivals for whatever scraps of attention remained, instead gave them common ground. Both now understood what it meant to be disposable in their father's grand scheme. Both had experienced the particular pain of Tudor family dynamics, and both possessed the intelligence to recognize that their survival might depend on supporting rather than sabotaging each other. Jane Seymour's death shortly after Edward's birth added another layer of complexity to the family's dynamics. Henry would marry 3 more times, but no more children would follow. For the rest of their father's lifetime, Mary and Elizabeth would share this peculiar status: royal but not quite legitimate, important but not essential, loved but only conditionally. Henry VIII breathed his last on January 28, 1547, leaving behind a kingdom transformed by his will and 3 children forever scarred by his ruthless pursuit of power and legacy. Though still technically illegitimate in the eyes of canon law, Both sisters found themselves restored to the succession line through Henry's final act of paternal policy, placed behind their 9-year-old brother in a line of inheritance that would shape England's future in ways none of them could imagine. But Edward, raised by Protestant tutors who had been carefully selected for their theological reliability, and advised by ambitious Protestant regents who saw in the boy king an opportunity to reshape English Christianity permanently, had inherited more than his father's crown. He had absorbed his father's absolute certainty about religious truth, his unwavering belief that opposition to his will was not merely political disagreement, but moral error that demanded correction. Edward's reign became a waking nightmare for Mary, whose Catholic faith had been forged in the fires of her mother's suffering and tempered by years of persecution. The fervent Catholic found herself in constant, escalating conflict with a brother who viewed her faith as not merely wrong or misguided, but as actively dangerous to his subjects' eternal souls. When she refused to use the New English prayer book that had replaced the Latin Mass of her childhood, when she continued saying Catholic Mass in her private chapel despite explicit royal orders to cease, their arguments became the stuff of court legend. The religious divide between them was more than theological disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews that made compromise impossible. Mary saw Edward's Protestant reforms as an attack on everything sacred, a betrayal of their father's original intentions, and a denial of centuries of Christian tradition. Edward, surrounded by advisors who painted Catholic practices as superstitious corruption, viewed Mary's stubborn adherence to the old faith as dangerous rebellion that threatened his authority and his subjects' salvation. One Christmas Eve stands out in historical memory as a perfect encapsulation of their impossible relationship. Brother and sister shouting at each other before the entire court, both reduced to tears over their irreconcilable religious differences, their family bond completely overshadowed by the theological chasm between them. Edward, despite being years younger and physically frailer, wielded the ultimate trump card in every argument. "You shall obey me. I am king." Mary's response revealed the depth of their family dysfunction and the impossibility of their situation. "You are my younger brother. I certainly do not take orders from you." These weren't simple family squabbles, but fundamental conflicts about the nature of authority, faith, and royal duty that could never be resolved through compromise or goodwill. Each sibling believed with absolute certainty that they were fighting for England's soul, and neither could yield without betraying everything they held sacred. As Edward lay dying in early 1553, his Protestant advisors faced a terrifying prospect that kept them awake at night. Mary's succession would undo everything they had built, every reform they had implemented, every Protestant foundation they had laid. Years of careful theological construction would crumble in months if the Catholic princess took the throne. In desperation, born of genuine terror, they convinced the teenage king to alter the succession through a legal device that pushed the boundaries of royal authority, removing both his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin who happened to be Protestant and conveniently married to the powerful regent's son. Edward died on July 6, 1553, at just 15 years old, his brief life consumed by the religious passions that had torn his family apart. His death was concealed for precious days, while the government frantically implemented their constitutional coup, knowing that every hour of delay increased the risk of discovery and failure. Meanwhile, Mary, warned by a loyal supporter who had ridden through the night at breakneck speed to reach her before the trap could close, escaped what would certainly have meant her imprisonment and quite possibly her execution. From her estates in East Anglia, where she commanded genuine popular support and could count on the loyalty of families who had served the Tudors for generations, she began the dangerous but necessary work of gathering troops, ready to fight a civil war if necessary for what she believed God had destined her to possess. The proclamation of Lady Jane Grey as Queen met with stony, uncomfortable silence in the streets of London. No cheers echoed through the narrow lanes, no celebration marked this historic moment. Just the awkward quiet of a people who recognized illegitimate power when they saw it, and wanted no part in validating what felt like a transparent political manipulation. Within days, as news of Edward's death spread throughout the kingdom, nobles across England began declaring for Mary in a spontaneous uprising that surprised even her most optimistic supporters. Even the Duke of Northumberland, who had orchestrated this elaborate coup and staked his life and fortune on its success, found himself forced to acknowledge the inevitable as his support melted away like snow in spring sunshine. The people wanted Henry VIII's daughter as their queen, not some distant cousin imposed by ambitious regents, and their will proved impossible to resist. Mary's triumphant entry into London was a masterpiece of royal theatre that demonstrated her deep understanding of ceremony and symbolic power. Clad in royal purple that caught the sunlight like liquid fire and blazing with jewels that proclaimed her wealth and status, she rode through streets lined with cheering crowds who had waited anxiously for this moment of restored legitimacy. Behind her rode Elizabeth, with her magnificent entourage of 1,000 horsemen in matching livery, their discipline and splendor a reminder that the Tudor family commanded resources and loyalty that no pretender could match. The sisters presented a carefully choreographed display of united strength, a living demonstration of Tudor legitimacy that reminded everyone watching of their father's overwhelming presence and the dynasty's deep roots in English soil. Elizabeth's massive retinue served a dual purpose. It showed her support for Mary's claim, while simultaneously demonstrating her own continued importance and the foolishness of underestimating any Tudor. But beneath the pageantry and celebration, beneath the cheering crowds and triumphant processions, political tensions simmered like magma beneath a peaceful mountain. Elizabeth, ever the consummate politician even at 19, supported her sister while carefully maintaining her own status and power base. She understood with precocious clarity that in this new reign she could serve as either invaluable ally or dangerous threat, and survival depended entirely on playing whichever role circumstances demanded with perfect conviction. Mary's coronation on October 1st sent a message that resonated throughout England and across Europe. This nation would return to the Catholic faith comprehensively and permanently, whether the people embraced this change willingly or required persuasion through more direct methods. The illegal Protestant services that had multiplied during Edward's reign would end immediately. The old rituals would return with all their familiar comfort and ceremony, and those who refused to comply would face consequences that grew more severe with each act of defiance. History would remember Mary by the epithet that still makes people shudder: Bloody Mary, the queen who sent 287 men, women and children to burn at the stake in just 5 years of increasingly desperate rule. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully planned demonstrations of royal will, each execution designed to send a message that reverberated far beyond the immediate victim to their family, their community, and anyone else who might be considering resistance to the restored Catholic order. Mary genuinely believed, with the fervor of someone whose faith had been tested in the fires of persecution, that a few spectacular public examples would convince the rest of the population to return to what she saw as the true faith. She felt a divine obligation, a sacred duty that transcended personal comfort or political calculation, to purge England of heresy and restore the spiritual health of a nation she believed had been corrupted by Protestant innovations. The fires that consumed her Protestant subjects were, in her tormented mind, acts of salvation that would save countless souls from eternal damnation. To secure England's Catholic future permanently, to ensure that her religious revolution would outlast her own mortality, Mary needed children. And for children, she needed a husband who could help her create the dynasty that would guarantee Catholic rule for generations. Her choice stunned the nation and terrified her advisors. Prince Philip of Spain, heir to the most powerful Catholic empire in Europe, and a man whose very name conjured images of Spanish dominance and foreign control. The marriage treaty negotiated between England and Spain promised that Philip would maintain only a minimal role in English government, that he would respect English laws and customs, and that any children would be raised as English royalty first and Spanish nobility second. But few people believed Spanish promises, and fewer still trusted that a Habsburg prince would resist the temptation to transform England into a Spanish dependency once he held real power through marriage to the Queen. The prospect of Spanish rule, of Protestant England becoming a Catholic satellite of the most powerful empire in the world, terrified English patriots who had grown accustomed to their nation's growing independence and Protestant identity. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a charismatic leader with deep Protestant convictions and genuine military experience, organized a rebellion aimed at removing Mary from the throne and replacing her with Elizabeth, gathering thousands of followers who were ready to die rather than see their country absorbed into the Spanish Empire. The rebellion failed after several tense weeks of maneuvering and skirmishing. Its leaders were publicly executed in the brutal fashion that characterized Tudor justice, and Elizabeth found herself in the most dangerous position of her young life. Many suspected she had been involved in the plot, either directly through secret communications or indirectly by serving as the symbolic focus around which Protestant resistance could organize. Elizabeth was taken to the Tower of London under heavy guard and imprisoned in the same apartments where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had awaited execution 20 years earlier. The symmetry was deliberate and terrifying, a reminder that royal blood provided no protection against royal justice when treason was suspected. She knew, with the clarity that comes from mortal terror, that a hair's breadth separated her from sharing her mother's fate at the block. Mary's advisors, men who understood that Elizabeth would always represent a potential rallying point for Protestant opposition, had drafted an order for her sister's execution. According to court witnesses, Mary held the document for long minutes, her hand poised to sign away her sister's life, the pen trembling in her fingers as she weighed dynasty against security, family against faith. At the last possible moment, whether moved by sisterly affection, political calculation, or divine intervention, Mary changed her mind. She spared Elizabeth's life, though the shadow of the executioner's axe would linger over the younger sister for months to come, a constant reminder of how quickly royal favor could turn to royal wrath. By the end of 1554, Catholic doctrine had returned to English churches with impressive speed and thoroughness, and the anti-heresy laws had been restored, giving Mary the legal framework she needed to begin the systematic persecution of those who refused to abandon their Protestant beliefs. The stage was set for the religious terror that would define her reign and earn her a place in the darkest chapters of English history. In late 1554, Mary experienced what she believed was the greatest joy of her life: pregnancy with the heir who would secure her Catholic revolution and provide England with a ruler who would continue her religious reforms long after her own death. The following spring, she summoned Elizabeth to court to witness the birth of the child who would replace her in the succession and affirm England's permanent return to Catholic rule. Everything seemed to be falling into place for Mary's grand design. She had secured the throne, restored the Catholic faith, married a powerful Catholic prince, and now carried the heir who would make her triumph complete. It was a moment of profound anxiety for Elizabeth and all English Protestants, who saw their hopes for religious freedom dying in Mary's womb. But the Tudor family's talent for dramatic reversals struck again with devastating force. The supposed pregnancy turned out to be a phantom, a cruel trick of biology that left Mary humiliated before her subjects and abandoned by her husband. Months passed in growing embarrassment as the due date came and went without any sign of a child. Finally, Mary had to step out of her bedroom and face the devastating humiliation of admitting to her court, her kingdom, and all of Europe that there was no baby, no heir, no Catholic future secured in her bloodline. The entire nation of England and the royal courts of Europe had held their breath waiting for news of the birth that would reshape the balance of religious power. Instead, they witnessed a queen's public humiliation that called into question not just her fertility, but her judgment, her health, and her fitness to rule. Mary was never robust in health, and modern medical historians believe she likely suffered from ovarian cancer in her later years, which would explain both the abdominal swelling that was mistaken for pregnancy and the increasingly erratic behavior that marked her final years. The phantom pregnancy represented more than personal disappointment. It was a public acknowledgement that her grand plan for Catholic restoration would die with her, leaving Elizabeth as the inevitable heir to a Protestant throne. Philip's reaction was swift and brutal in its honesty. Mary's Spanish husband, who had married her for political advantage rather than love, and had endured her passionate devotion with barely concealed impatience, departed for Spain in disgust and embarrassment. He would return only once, briefly, in the months before Mary's death. But his abandonment marked the effective end of their marriage and left Mary to face the collapse of all her dreams in complete isolation. The queen who had fought so hard for her throne, who had risked civil war to claim her birthright and executed hundreds to secure her religious vision, found herself alone, childless, and increasingly irrelevant as her subjects began the inevitable process of transferring their loyalty to her successor. Mary's Spanish marriage, which had been intended to strengthen England's position in European politics, instead isolated the country from potential allies and made England appear to be nothing more than a Spanish satellite. The Habsburg Wars had made Philip an enemy of the Pope himself, shattering Mary's dream of England united with Rome under Spanish protection. As Mary's health declined visibly in 1558, her poor condition becoming a subject of international speculation and concern, courtiers began their familiar and ruthless dance of shifting allegiances. Like moths inevitably drawn to flame, they fluttered toward Hatfield House, where Elizabeth waited with growing confidence and an expanding circle of advisors who were already planning for the post-Mary era. The dying queen could see it happening with painful clarity. The inexorable transfer of power from the setting sun to the rising one, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the increasing frequency with which important decisions were delayed pending further consultation. Mary's reign, which had begun with such triumph and promise, was ending in isolation and the bitter knowledge that everything she had worked to achieve would be undone by her Protestant sister. By mid-1558, Mary's poor health was widely known throughout England and across Europe, with foreign ambassadors sending regular reports about her condition to their respective courts. Her judgment, once sharp and decisive, could be seen to deteriorate as illness and disappointment took their toll. She began to lose the political control that had been her greatest strength, finding herself unable to reconcile different factions at court or provide the strong leadership that had initially made her reign successful. The country, with its finely tuned instincts for political survival, began to sense weakness in their monarch and to prepare for the transition that now seemed inevitable. English subjects had never been comfortable with weak rulers, viewing royal frailty as a judgment upon the entire nation and a source of potential disaster. Mary Tudor died on November 17th, 1558, her grand dreams of Catholic restoration dying with her in a reign that had lasted just over 5 years. Yet history would prove, with the irony that marks so many political transformations, that her troubled reign had established crucial precedents that would benefit the very sister whose beliefs she had opposed so bitterly. Elizabeth, inheriting a kingdom scarred by religious conflict and economic hardship, would build her legendary reign upon foundations that Mary had inadvertently laid. The financial reforms that would fund Elizabeth's naval expansion, the administrative structures that would support the Elizabethan Golden Age, and the governmental precedents that would make female rule not just acceptable, but admirably effective, all had their origins in Mary's troubled but groundbreaking years on the throne. The Tudor sisters, both forged in the crucible of their father's ruthless ambition and tempered by years of conflict that would have broken weaker spirits, had proven beyond doubt that gender was no barrier to royal authority. They were equally intelligent, equally capable of the political scheming that successful monarchy required, and equally determined to leave their mark on English history regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. Their rivalry, born of Henry VIII's brutal machinations and nurtured by years of religious conflict, had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the English monarchy. Each sister had demonstrated different aspects of royal power: Mary's passionate commitment to her beliefs, Elizabeth's political flexibility and diplomatic skill, and together they had proven that the Tudor bloodline was strong enough to survive even the most toxic family dynamics. What began as a tale of three siblings scarred by their father's cruelty became something far more historically significant, proof that even the most damaged family relationships could not destroy the essential strength that flows in royal blood when combined with intelligence, determination, and the will to survive. The Tudor dynasty, nearly shattered by Henry's ruthless pursuit of a male heir, was ultimately secured not by the son he had sacrificed so much to obtain, but by the daughters whose strength and resilience he had never fully appreciated. The crown passed from sister to sister, not through the violence and civil war that had marked so many previous transitions, but through the simple, powerful recognition that both women were equally capable of bearing the awesome weight and responsibility of English kingship. In the end, Henry VIII's greatest legacy wasn't Edward, the son who died too young to prove himself, but Mary and Elizabeth, the daughters whose combined reigns would define England for nearly half a century and establish the precedents that would guide the monarchy for generations to come. If this glimpse into the dark heart of the Tudor dynasty, with its tales of sibling rivalry, religious persecution, and the ultimate triumph of female power over male expectations, has left you hungry for more royal secrets and historical revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew about England's most fascinating royal family, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel, because the corridors of power hold countless stories of ambition, betrayal, and survival that will captivate and surprise you episode after episode.